I've had moments where I will wake up and I'm like, what? I'm 3 pounds heavier than yesterday? Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. I'm Courtney, and this is my brother Paris, and today we are going to be talking about weigh-ins, because when we talk about fitness transformation, people do get kind of hung up on the scale, especially when we see all this messaging around how many pounds are involved in a fitness transformation, and we're here to help you understand it a little bit better so we can all figure out what place it actually has in evaluating the success of your fitness journey.
Definitely. Yeah, important topic because obviously it's one of the most common variables that people track in their fitness journey. And, there's merit behind that as well. But we also need to understand kind of the role that variable tracking plays and to make sure we understand also the psychology about it. Oh, well, and to add on also not only the psychology, but also what affects this number that we're seeing, so that we can not let it play games with our head, essentially.
Yeah, because you're right. It is hard to have a completely objective perspective on the scale.
For sure.
We see it with ourselves and with our clients, right? Like to tell somebody, oh, just see it as a data point. Like that's what we want to say, but it's hard to actually just see it as a data point. But the number one thing that can actually help you start to, emotionally disconnect a little bit from the number on the scale is actually understanding what that number means logically and what it represents. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in today's episode, which is understanding why the scale weight changes so much so quickly, and sometimes not as quickly as we want it to, sometimes more quickly than we expect, right? And how to help you really interpret your body weight and the fluctuations that we will see with body weight. So
exactly,
we frame this episode around the question of why did your scale weight go up overnight? I don't know about you, Paris, but I've had moments where I will wake up and I'm like, what? I'm 3 pounds heavier than yesterday? Yeah. So it's a common experience. And I think by framing this conversation around that question, it helps us really start to learn about the variables that create that sense of fluctuation and help us then take that more logical, objective approach to scale numbers.
I like it. And I want to throw in a little trick for somebody who might be overly obsessed with the scale before we kind of dive into the practical things. And if you're a coach listening to this as well, this is maybe something good and something I do with clients that are a little bit more, psychologically impacted from the scale number, is I'll actually eliminate the 2 outlier weigh-ins from the week. So I'll actually delete the lowest weigh-in and I'll delete the highest weigh-in. So we still have our weekly average, but it gives less impact to each individual number. So it's less like, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out about this number, because the outliers will be removed. So we still take a weekly average, but it just makes it less stressful when if I had this weird number, don't let it play with your head as much.
That's a good point. And if you're sitting here going, what? Wait. What about the weekly average? Why are we talking about weekly averages? Keep watching, because we're going to explain why that is so important. But I think, Paris, you're right. If you kind of eliminate the outlier numbers, then you don't get fixated on this number was super high or haha, I attained this super low, right? And just kind of helping to smooth things out.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the first thing we need to clarify before we dive into understanding a little bit more about scale weight and what causes the fluctuations is actually what that number on the scale is telling you. What is it about body weight that we need to keep in mind? And the number one thing I think of is body weight is not body fat.
Yeah, exactly.
But we use them interchangeably for kind of the wrong reasons. So let's actually talk about what the number on the scale actually represents.
Yeah, so it's just a way of measuring how much we weigh at any given time. That's literally it. Whether you're measuring in kilograms or in pounds, it doesn't tell you how much fat or muscle you have. It doesn't tell you how great you look. All it does is it just tells you how much you weigh, using physics as a way to tell us one number at any given moment in time.
I mean, I kind of wish I could step on the scale and the thing would be like, you look fantastic today. If it did tell me how great I look, that'd be really...
You don't have the same scale?
Yeah. No, you got to send me a link to where I can purchase your scale, because that sounds really validating. Yes, so it is essentially a measure of how much mass you are taking up in space at a given point in time. And body fat, we'd be remiss if we didn't say body fat is a source of body weight, but it's not the only source of body weight. People hear all the time, oh, muscle weighs more than fat and things like that, right? Muscle is something that also contributes to body weight, but there are a number of things that do change from one day to the next when you measure how much you weigh on a given day. And your muscle mass and your body fat are not those things. And I think that's the first point of clarification is I wish I could put on muscle from one day to the next. it just doesn't work that way. And with body fat, I think people greatly overestimate how quickly body fat actually can come on. And it's not something that we expect to change day to day. It's something we expect to change over time.
Yeah, in like any significant way. So yeah, any big fluctuations up or down in scale weight are not going to be reflective of muscle or fat changes, right? Because
Exactly.
as Courtney said, the time course of losing fat and building muscle is not a 10-hour period between you going to bed and you waking up or whatever, you know?
Right. So what is it? Let's go there next.
Yeah.
What actually causes changes in body weight from one day to the next? So in those moments where I wake up 3 pounds heavier, what do I need to keep in mind that might have led to that 3-pound gain?
Yeah. So I think one of the main ones I think about is water weight fluctuations, which there's a multitude of variables that can impact this one, but it can be pretty significant. And one of the main ones is like how much sodium you have, or you've consumed. Like, let's say your baseline sodium intake is at a certain level, and then you have one day where you went for all you can eat sushi, or you had a bunch of soy sauce, or you had a high salt meal. You will retain more water because water flows down its concentration gradient. I've said in the creatine podcast, go check it out. Subtle plug for that.
Week's.
So water will be pulled to be stored if we have one day of just high sodium. And again, that has nothing to do with body fat. It's just we're going to be storing more water. But there are some other reasons. Go ahead.
Can I just interrupt on that one? Because someone close to us sent me a very unnerving reel that another, I'm going to say coach in air quotes here, had posted this reel about like, if you want to lose fat, you need to cut out all salt. And I was like, what the
That's
heck?
The stupidest thing I've ever
That is so, not only is that stupid, it's wrong, and it has nothing to do with body fat, but they were saying, well, think about if you have a lot of salt and then your ring doesn't fit on your finger. And I think that is a good example of like how we might retain more water, but please do not fall for that nonsense if you see it on social media. The relationship with salty foods is really the salt component, and body weight is really the salt component, and how that leads to water retention. So if you're finding yourself feeling like, hey, I look puffier or I'm bloating in certain areas, a lot of that from salt is going to be water retention. It has nothing to do with body fat.
No, exactly. And that's so dumb. Like I would say my salt intake is actually higher in a fat loss phase when I'm getting leaner than it would be in a building phase, just because I'm more likely to salt my meals, especially pre-training, to actually keep my blood pressure high. That's a weird thing, but I'm like prone to like having dips in blood pressure. So I'll like salt my meals a little bit heavier when I'm in a fat loss phase. And also don't forget training performance, like why in the world would you eliminate salt, especially pre-training, when we know how important that is for like muscle contraction and pumps? Like, good luck getting a pump if you have no salt.
You've talked about that in previous episodes. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, Paris has really commented on how salt actually helps with muscle contractions, right? And so I actually thought you were going to say in a fat loss phase, you salt your food more so it tastes better, because sometimes we're eating more bland foods or things like that. But I think the important thing for this context is salt can lead to water retention. So like you said, with sushi, every time I have sushi, my weight goes up. And there's a second reason why, which we're going to explain in a second. But the first one is because I ingest a lot of soy sauce and a lot of salt.
Yeah, for sure.
What else causes that water retention component? Because you were speaking about how that's the biggest one that can change the scale weight.
Yeah, so the other one would be hormonal fluctuations, and especially like for the women listening, like you'll know on a monthly basis, you have quite a considerable fluctuation in hormones compared to men. And with that comes differences in water retention. So you might have, some of our women clients might even have like a 5-pound swing, depending on what time of the month it is, which has nothing to do with their body composition. It's literally just water weight fluctuations, which is crazy. Not all women experience that significant of fluctuation. For some women, it's like negligible fluctuation. So you just got to kind of know yourself and be like, okay, I understand why this is happening today, why the scale's higher or whatever, right? So that's the main one. I don't know if you want to comment on that as a woman.
Yeah, I can. As the woman in the virtual room here, I definitely have learned that about myself and my own experience. And like you said, it is going to be different from every person or for every woman. For me, I can tell based on the time of my cycle too, like when I would expect a little bit of a drop, because I often get like a drop before my time of the month and then it kind of comes back up, right? So those sorts of patterns, I think that's where recording your weigh-in data actually becomes helpful, because it helps you learn more about your body's response to those things. So for me, because, it's been years and years and years of me having, a cycle and also tracking my weigh-in data, I've learned to expect certain changes in the scale at those times of the month. And I think that's really empowering.
It is, and it also is why I like to look at longer time frames for women, which we'll
Hmm.
get to later on things like that. But
Hmm.
it's just important, just yet another variable. But that's not the only; those are not the only variables that can affect like hormone fluctuations, would then affect water tension,
Right. It's
because
not
there's
just for
other
women in the
hormones
time
too.
of the month,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Hmm.
exactly. Like for example, one of the major ones, we don't have to dive into everything, but for stress hormones like cortisol, for example, like those will promote water tension. So let's say you had a really bad night's sleep, which is a stressor on the body, or you're going through, I don't know, something in your personal life that is a little bit more stressful, or you're under some sort of psychological or physical stress, you will retain more water because cortisol will be higher.
Hmm.
Again, has nothing to do with body fat or muscle. It's just more water retention. But typically, when that stress dissipates, that
Yeah.
water weight will go to.
I'd love to share a personal anecdote here too as well. Like when I was working my corporate job, my weeks were often really stressful and I didn't always take care of sleep as much as I needed to. I'd have like late nights up working or trying to, do our TBS work on the side. And by the time Sunday came around, after I had like, let's say a good sleep Friday night into Saturday and then another good sleep Saturday, I would almost always have a low weigh-in on Sunday mornings. And
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't because I like suddenly lost body fat on a Sunday. There's nothing magical about Sundays for body fat loss. It was just because I had dissipated the stress of my week by the time Sunday came
Yeah,
around. And the scale
exactly.
consistently reflected that back to me.
And I think we can all relate to that. Where if you ever have been in a relatively lean body composition, and then when you have a good night's sleep, you wake up and you're like, "Wow, I'm crisp today." Or if you have a really poor night's sleep, you wake up, you're like, "We look a little blurry today," you know.
Hmm.
So, and that's just a perfect example of that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Anything else on water retention that you want to speak about for scale weight?
Um, Well, the next one I think that we'll talk about is a little bit connected to water tension in a way. So maybe that's a perfect kind of segue if we're cool with that.
Yeah, of course. Let's
Jumping
go
in.
for it.
Yeah. So I think we want to talk about carbohydrates, right? And carbohydrates get stored in our muscles as glycogen, and glycogen pulls water into the muscle. So if you're on a higher carbohydrate diet, you will inevitably store more water. Or if one day you had a giant influx of carbohydrates, guess what? You're going to pull more water into the muscle.
Remember when I said that with sushi there was two things? The first one was the salt from the soy sauce. The second one is the carbs, right? Because it's a high carb meal. If I have sushi for dinner the night before, I'm going to have kind of double water retention, one from the carbs and two from the soy sauce and the salt. So I think that's another great example. I often think of it this way too, is like even if we took out the whole like glycogen storage in the muscle component and we just think about what happens when you put a piece of bread in a glass of water. Not that I do that regularly because that's a weird thing to do, but think about it, right? If I put a piece of bread in a glass of water, it's going to absorb the water. It's kind of a very similar thing that happens in your body in terms of how carbs store water. And you did a great reel on this recently as well on your Instagram, Paris. But just I think knowing that every gram of carbs stores 3 to 4 grams of water is
Mhm.
really helpful to help you understand how much body weight and scale weight can actually be affected by carb intake.
Yeah. And again, if you're keeping your carb intake relatively consistent, then you won't have these big swings. But if for some reason one day you wake up super heavy and you're like, "Oh, right, I had this extra amount of carbs yesterday or whatever," then it's like nothing to freak out over.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And just putting it into context, which will probably be our final thought that we conclude with in the end as we wrap up as well. What about the next
Right.
variable? So we've talked about water retention, how many things can impact that. We've talked about carbs and glycogen storage, which is related to water retention. What else can actually affect scale weight from a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So the next one is just actually the amount of food sitting in your gut. So let's
Hmm.
just say you ate a lot of food and it's just sitting there. There's going to be weight of that food, right?
Right, food
So
weighs something
like,
too.
food has a weight to it.
Yeah.
So it's just logically speaking, if we have more food sitting in the gut,
Hmm.
then voila,
Hmm.
our weigh-in is going to be slightly higher,
Right.
right?
And related to that, whether or
Mhm.
not we have expelled said food from our guts will also have a role to play, right? So, how recently you've used the bathroom, whether or not you've used the bathroom that morning that you're weighing in, sometimes when people travel, for example, their regularity changes. And so, you might not have gone yet. And therefore, that's extra weight also still sitting in your system.
Definitely. Which, if you combine a lot of these variables that we're talking about, like it can start to add up to significant swings.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, there's one more that I think is kind of maybe a less concrete one, but I did want to kind of acknowledge it because in my experience, it has been a factor. And I'm going to say training inflammation.
Mhm. Mm-hmm.
Like sometimes when I train really hard and I'm feeling that lingering soreness, and which is, just essentially a little bit of inflammation, the muscles aren't yet recovered. Sometimes my weigh-ins are a little bit heavier, and that doesn't mean it's caused by that necessarily, but it is something to potentially consider in relation to understanding scale weight.
Yeah, and I think with that, if I'm not mistaken, it also has to do with just more fluid retention in
Exactly.
general.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, if you hit a massive leg day and you're like, whoa, and then you wake up in the morning and going to be a little bit more inflammation, which is
Mm-hmm.
just a normal thing that happens with training. It's nothing to be like worried about.
Exactly.
Typically, there's just a bit more fluid retention, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
That's my understanding of it as well.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think it's something I just want to throw out there because if somebody, let's say somebody is starting their fat loss or weight loss journey and they haven't really done consistent resistance training before and they start their journey and they see their scale weight go up, again, there's no single factor, there's a number of factors here. But that is something to consider, being like, why I'm working out now and all of a sudden my scale weight's going up, right? That sort of thing. It's a smaller variable. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and also when you start resistance training, you will store more glycogen because you'll store more carbs just because your body is now in demand. Like your muscles need more carbs stored so
Yeah,
that
it's a
they can
primary energy source.
pursue exercise. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you will have an increase in glycogen storage just by virtue of starting to regularly weight train. So that is
Mm-hmm.
also something to consider as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so now we've covered off like understanding daily fluctuations, where they come
Mm-hmm.
from, water retention, and the number of things that inspire water retention, glycogen storage and carbs, food volume and bulk, digestion, training, inflammation. So already from this conversation that we've had in the last few minutes, you can just see how many variables there actually are that will
Mm-hmm.
affect a given weigh-in on a given day. So the main takeaway from that is we shouldn't be afraid of or wary of daily fluctuations in body weight. We should expect them because
Mm-hmm.
there's pretty much, I'm going to say there's no way we can control to a T all of those variables to perfectly align every single day
No.
in the exact same way. It's impossible. So expect those fluctuations on the daily scale. Now, though, with that in mind, there are certain things we can do to at least create certain conditions of control to try to weigh in and take scale weight data at the most similar context as possible from a day-to-day basis. So I'd love
Yes.
to explore that now, and then from there we can move into how do we actually use that data once we collect it. So let's talk about how to collect it in the best way possible to at least minimize those fluctuations as much as we can.
Yeah, so this is one of the major mistakes that I see with people taking weigh-ins is that they'll weigh it at inconsistent times during the day and even using different scales and in completely different contexts. I also made a reel about this where people at the gym will weigh
Yeah.
themselves,
Yeah.
which makes
Number one
absolutely
mistake you can make is weighing yourself at the gym.
because you've had a different amount of water that day, food in your system. You're wearing clothes. People will do it with their shoes on. Like it just makes absolutely no sense. So we want to keep the context as consistent as possible. So we remove one potential variable of fluctuation. So we want to take our weigh-ins in the morning before eating or drinking, after using the washroom, and without wearing any clothes. That's the context that we want to take it, and ideally multiple times per week. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because when you start to now all of a sudden, okay, take it in the morning, it doesn't matter what you've eaten or drank at that day. We said it could matter what you did the night before. If there's food bulk in your system, okay, that just so be it. But at least by taking it in the morning, you're minimizing the impact of how the day has progressed. I think the obvious, like not wearing clothes, is the most obvious because, like, I don't know, in the winter, I bet you my clothes
You
are
think,
heavier than in the summer, right?
yeah, you would think it would be obvious.
I know. I think that's the most, let's say maybe not obvious, but most directly able to control, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then I think what else you were saying about just like the time of day and the context and, not making sure you've like, okay, I've exercised or I haven't exercised today or all those things.
Yeah, just wake up, use the washroom before eating or drinking, without wearing any clothes, take the first number, put in your sheets or in your, write it down or in your app or whatever you're using to track your scale weight.
Yeah. One thing you kind of said in passing that I just want to call it again is like the scale you use does matter. Like they're all calibrated slightly differently. Their mechanisms are slightly different. For example, let's say you traveled and you didn't have access to your regular scale. It might actually be better just to not take that data instead of stepping on a different scale and having warped data.
Yeah, it's not valid data when we take it on a different measuring system. So because yeah, some scales will weigh you like 3 pounds difference. What I found
Hmm.
up to
Hmm.
3, 4 even pounds difference
Yeah.
between scales. So yeah, if you're traveling, unless you can bring your own scale, if it's like a driving trip, then
Hmm.
you know,
Don't worry
then
about
just
it.
don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure. So taking your weigh-ins with as similar conditions as possible every time you step on the scale is actually paramount to being able to use that data in a way that's valid and credible and minimizes the impact of all those fluctuations that we spoke to. What
exactly.
are the best practices for collecting weigh-in data then, other than just taking it in the same context?
Yeah, so I usually recommend for our just typical general population client trying to get in good shape, like 4 or more. That's my rhyme, so I like to use that. 4 or more weigh-ins per week, so we can start collecting some trends. For competition prep clients, I say take it every day.
Hmm. Yeah.
The more data, the better. We want to have as much data as possible in a competition prep setting. And but then as I started like this conversation with earlier with you was just if you're worried about the skill, then taking more weigh-ins just gives you experience, and experience typically kills anxiety. So if you're anxious about it, if you only weigh yourself once a month, you'll give so much. Oh my gosh, this number, what's it going to be? There's so much like thought around
Build
that
up,
one specific.
anticipation.
Yeah, there's too much
Yeah.
stress. But if you weigh yourself every day, at a certain point, it's like another number,
Mhm.
right? And if you're really worried about it, just eliminate the two outliers, top and bottom, from your weigh-ins, and that way you don't have to worry about any given day that's not what you like to see or whatever.
Yeah, two builds I have on that. The first one is I think the more that you actually do that weigh-in data, the more you actually put yourself in a position to learn about what causes those fluctuations.
Mm-hmm.
For me, every time I kind of weigh in the morning and I see a number, I'll be like, okay, what happened yesterday that might have influenced this or whatever it is. So you just kind of see the patterns. Like you actually
Yeah,
start to see the patterns between when certain numbers look a certain way. Like the thing I said earlier about Sundays, I always saw a drop off, right? And so the more often you collect it, the more you enable yourself to be able to detect the patterns. And then the second thing you said was around like weekly averages, right? And just like when you do, I'm going back to what you said earlier here,
mm-hmm.
when you do take out those outliers and you see the weekly average, it can be really helpful because then all of a sudden you're smoothing things over in terms of the fluctuation. So you're starting to look at trend lines instead
Yes.
of absolute numbers. And then you can look at the relative change from one week to the next instead of the change between individual weigh ins.
I think that's extremely important point to hammer home here, Courtney, is that, yeah, we're looking at moving averages almost
Mm-hmm.
instead of exact numbers, as you said, absolute numbers. That's a perfect way of saying it, because a lot of times we might be like, oh my gosh, I'm not losing weight. But then when you zoom out and you look at all your data as a whole, you're like, oh no, the trend is actually going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And again, having moving averages, it relieves us from the pressure of making any one weigh in have so much importance. So that's why I think it's important to do that. And for men, maybe we're a bit more predictable on a month to month basis, with fluctuations. So we might look at more, okay, week over week or biweekly. But then for women, maybe you're looking at like a 3 week moving average in
Mm-hmm.
some cases, if you're the type of woman that has large fluctuations in water due to your cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. So I think we've now covered off what causes the fluctuations and how to interpret them, how to mitigate them the best we can. I think to start kind of moving forward from this, it's just the mindset stuff is tricky. We always like to leave a bit of a mindset tip behind when we do these podcast episodes. This one is tricky because there is a lot of very deep rooted psychology around scale weight. And if you are somebody who is very emotionally attached to the scale, it might be worth trying to investigate and do some reflection around why and what that number means for you. But before we actually move into the specific mindset tips, can I just say one of my favorite quotes of yours?
Go for it.
Okay. You always talk about how we walk around in our bodies, not
Mm-hmm.
with our scale weight on a post-it note on top of our heads,
Yes,
right?
true. Yeah.
And I want to go back to that quote because it does have merit in the context of this conversation. And why I also don't believe in like absolute numbers. We weigh what we weigh, and there is something absolute to that. But at the end of the day, the way you feel in your body and the way you see yourself and how your body actually looks is usually what we are aiming for, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have this like concept of like a goal weight, but they might actually be really satisfied with their appearance before they hit that weight. And
Mm-hmm.
they should not invalidate that satisfaction because they haven't reached a goal weight. Likewise, for me personally, I actually am at the same weight that I was at probably about 5 years ago, but my body composition is very different. It looks
Yes.
very different.
Yeah.
And that's also something that has helped me disassociate from the scale is to recognize that I can I'm way more confident in how my body looks now, even though the weight is the same.
That's so important because over time in your fitness journey, you almost want to make the same body weight look better and better and better and better. And as you put on more muscle, your body composition at any given body weight will be better. Like for me right now, I'm at somewhere around 180. This is a so much. This is so much better of a body composition than I've been at previously. At 180, I was like a kind of a pudgy 180 for my standards. But now, like this is not a bad. It's not a bad 180. But that's relative to what I know about my body. But if I only looked at that and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm 180," I was like freaking out about it. But I said, "Hey, look what it used to look like at 180 compared to now." Like that's why we don't just use the scale weight as the only source of data. We look at it for directionality depending on the phase that we're in, but we don't measure it as like a point in time. Is this compared to this and that? It's going to tell us everything about our progress.
Absolutely. And the most important thing too is not only does it not tell you everything about your body, it also doesn't tell you everything about yourself. Like you should never identify yourself with a number on the scale. Your value as a human being is not tied to a number on the scale.
Or your physique too.
Or your physique, right? Your value as a human is not tied to your physique either, 100%. So as much as, in our conversations, we talk about physique development because that's what we do. Like we work on fitness transformations, but it's also why we talk about transformation and lifestyle and mindset and all that as well, because they all come together and they're all important. And so, you being 180 doesn't mean anything about you as a human being and the character that you bring to the world. And I also want to say, like, we might be coming from a slightly privileged position where neither one of us has experience with obesity personally, firsthand. Mm-hmm. We've worked with people who are, who are battling obesity and working to bring their weight down. And in those contexts, the number on the scale can be a really positive indicator of your progress when you are seriously overweight but it's not because the number, it's because reducing body fat will actually be shown through the number on the scale. And that has health implications, positive health implications.
Yes.
So we do need to acknowledge that in those contexts, scale weight does have a little bit more meaning than it might for you or I.
100%. Yeah. When you're starting at a very high body fat percentage, you might look at the scale weight pretty much all the time as one of the main ways of seeing progress, especially since I made a presentation for this in our group chat the other day. When you lose body fat, when you're starting at a higher body fat percentage, the visual changes are not nearly as significant because that chunk of body fat represents a smaller percentage of your overall fat mass. So if you are starting at a higher body fat percentage and you lose 10 pounds of body fat, you won't yet really see the visual difference very clearly compared to somebody like if I were to drop 10 pounds of body fat, it would be a very noticeable visual difference just because that would be a larger percentage of the overall fat mass I have left. So it's just kind of acknowledging that. So at the beginning of your fat loss journey, if you're starting at a higher body fat percentage, you might use a scale weight more as an indicator of progress, as you said.
100%. And just as a shout out, we do have a previous episode that we did on how can you measure progress along your fitness journey. So we'll link that here as well. And we do talk about different metrics you can rely on to evaluate progress when it comes to physique and fat loss and overall physique development. One thing, though, I think that is also important when you are starting more overweight is your fluctuations will also likely be greater. Yeah. So for me, going up or down 3 pounds, from one day to the next, that can happen. But for some of our clients, who have started with a little bit more body fat and at heavier body weights, those fluctuations can easily be 6 pounds because as a relative percentage change from one day to the next, it is probably either the same or smaller relative percentage. Yeah. So I think just if you are, a little bit heavier currently, knowing that those fluctuations that you experience can actually be quite notable as an absolute number, right? But then again, just take everything we've said in terms of understanding the logic behind those fluctuations, how it works, and continuing to focus on the trend lines.
That's a great point. And I also find for people that have lost a lot of body fat and have maybe a little bit more loose skin, their propensity to hold onto water, body water, they can collect more body water. So you will see bigger fluctuations even in scale weight, even once you've dropped a lot of body fat. So it's just something to think about in regards to that as well. Yeah.
Great point, Paris. That's a really great point. Okay, I think we're ready to wrap things up. We've talked
Yep.
about why your scale weight can change so much overnight. It's all very logical reasons, which doesn't mean that it always is a logical reaction that you have. We're all human, we all have emotional reactions, that's okay. But we hope that this conversation at least helps you start to think more objectively about what the number on the scale represents. Is there anything else you want to add as like a takeaway for people before we wrap up?
I think we covered things pretty well. The only other thing I would say in regards to scale weight that I could think of right now is when you're transitioning between phases,
Mm-hmm.
expect more significant drops or gains, I would say, in body weight. So you can almost kind of ignore maybe the first few days of data. Like, for example, if you're transitioning from a building phase into a fat loss phase or vice versa, you will have a transient spike or drop off in body weight just because of the variables that we mentioned with
Mm-hmm.
food bulk and water weight and glycogen
Right.
and all these things. So you can almost kind of ignore the initial kind of
Yeah.
big swings.
I actually think that's especially important when it comes to fat loss. If you're starting a fat loss phase, usually that means that two things. One, you start eating in a calorie deficit, and that is usually often for many people less food bulk. And that calorie deficit is often accompanied by a decrease in carbs. So it is likely that when you start a fat loss phase, you do see a considerable drop off. It doesn't mean you lost body fat in 3 days, right? It means that you likely had less water retention and less glycogen storage. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, not just because we can say, okay, that might be outlier data, but because I think it does shape how people then take the next steps of their fat loss journey. If you're
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I lost 3 pounds in the first 2 days, that's amazing. And then all of a sudden your rate of body weight scale
Yeah.
changes or slows. It does not mean that you've hit a plateau. And it does not mean that
Yes,
you are
that's
not
so
making
true.
progress. And I
Yeah.
think we need to hammer that thought home. And it's the same reason why so many people will be like, I lost 5 pounds in my first 2 days of keto. And it's because, well, you cut out all carbs. You're not storing that water or glycogen anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's just really important that you start to evaluate the progress in your fat loss phase, maybe like a week when we say progress is scale weight, maybe a week after you've started and stuck to a structure with your nutrition
Mm-hmm.
there, because it'll actually help you understand your real weight of body weight changes and interpret that data with a little bit more credibility.
Yeah. I like it. Perfect.
Okay, that was a more intense wrap up than I was expecting, but I do think that that was an important one. So
Yeah.
it's really important because when we talk about seeing changes in the scale weight, most of the time people are looking for fat loss. So we do need to really dive into that context a little bit more.
Love it. Tons of value in this one.
Yes, lots of value. And this is very real. If you are somebody who weighs yourself regularly or irregularly, we hope this helped you understand a little bit more about what's behind that number and why it can actually change on us so often and so frequently. So, if you have a relationship with body weight and you're using body weight metrics in a certain way, we'd love to hear how you actually use body weight data to guide your fitness journey, what role it plays for you, and if you've actually seen these fluctuations firsthand. So please comment below if you feel comfortable sharing your experience. And without further ado, we would love if you subscribe as well. If you're not already subscribed to our podcast here, we put these episodes out every single Monday. And if you have a question you would like us to answer next, please send us a DM on Instagram at Truth Body Systems or drop that question in the comment below and we'll be sure to tackle it. All right.
Perfect.
We will be back in your feeds next Monday with another episode of Truth Talks. In the meantime, have a great week ahead. Bye for now.